watching Leafs Morning Take with host Nick Alberga and former NHLer Jay Rosehill. The show starts now.
Two teams coming off losses in Carolina are set to tangle in Toronto. It's the crossover you've all been waiting for. Nick Alberga, David Quadrelli in Vancouver, presented by Bet365. This is a Leafs Morning Take Canucks conversation crossover quad. What's going on, buddy?
Oh, not much. I'm excited. It was a tough slog for the Canucks last night, so looking forward to getting right back to it. Some travel troubles for the Canucks. That's obviously going to be something we focus on today.
Oh, that's going to be a big story for sure, Quads. But you got to tell me, is this your Christmas? I know Canucks fans, they get fired out to play the Toronto Maple Leafs on Hockey Night in Canada, don't they?
Well, it would be, but I'll give you an analogy, okay? Yep. It's Christmas, but on Christmas Eve, your parents got in a massive fight. Things were thrown. The police showed up. Your whole house is an absolute mess. You had to sleep at your grandparents' house. That's the analogy that we should use right now. So it's not like normal Christmas days. Let's just put it that way. It was tough sledding for the Canucks last night in Carolina. It was a really, really rough game for them. Pointed out a lot of flaws in their roster. Just the troubles that they've had on the back end whenever Quinn Hughes isn't on the ice. They've had troubles all season long. It was really bad last night. The forwards could get nothing going. Carolina was playing their 5th and 7. That should have told you enough. It was a second of a back-to-back. As you know, they played the Leafs the night prior. Dustin Tokarski was in net. He gets the 3rd shutout of his career in his 85th NHL start at age 35. It was not a good game for the Canucks, to put it lightly. Let's put it this way, Nick. The thing that a lot of people are pointing out right now, and I think it's a fair criticism, is to play the way that the Canucks want to play with Rick Tocchet, it takes a lot out of you. Like, it's scrumming along the wall. It's a lot of wall work. It's a lot of winning puck battles. And then it's getting the puck to a defenseman or whoever. And then when that defenseman is Noah Juulsen, it kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. And it must hamper your spirits a bit. And I'm not trying to give these players any sort of, sympathy. But last night was pretty evident that the players might just be a bit exhausted.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about, obviously, in Vancouver and certainly in Toronto. Should mention first and foremost, if you're watching right now, first-time subscriber, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. So at the Leafs Nation 401 for us here at Leafs Morning Take wherever you find your podcast for quads. At Canucks Army on YouTube, Canucks Conversation wherever you find your podcast, and CanucksArmy.com, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, nailed it.
Beautiful. Okay, let's get into it. So it's Rick Tocchet, Craig Berube getting together. And as mentioned, both teams coming off a loss in Carolina. But I'd be remiss if we didn't start with the whole Vancouver Canucks conversation. Like, I'll be honest, obviously there's a lot of smoke. Toronto's always the mecca for these rumors and the conversation. What can you tell us about what's going on? Because from an outsider's perspective, Quads, I watched this team now 4 straight losses. They can go on a 5-game road trip and lose all 5 games, and you capitalize. They have to. This is a massive game, I think, for Vancouver tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I think you felt more confident heading into Carolina than you did Toronto for the reasons that I just said, right? Like, Carolina had played a lot of hockey. They were coming off the second leg of a back-to-back. Tokarski was in net, all those factors. I think if you were a Canucks fan, you felt pretty confident about how the Canucks were going to play in yesterday's game, even though they were still the underdogs. Tonight, I don't think it's the same thing. Tonight, I think it's, okay, just hang on. It's almost the end of a trip. This is going to be a tough one. They were stuck in Carolina due to icy weather last night. They didn't get a flight to Toronto until this morning. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one because I don't think there's any Canucks fans that are puffing out their chest right now and saying, oh, yeah, Canucks have this in the bag. You said it, like, Canucks fans love when the Canucks beat the Leafs. It has happened a lot over the past few years, even though the Leafs have had the better team on paper. It has happened a lot, even though, even in years the Canucks weren't making the playoffs, it was happening. But that being said, I don't think there's a ton of confidence right now among Canucks fans with how the team played last night. And really, not just how they played last night. Your question was the bigger picture, how the season's gone. That's been the story, is when Quinn Hughes isn't on the ice, they can't do anything. And it comes down to roster construction, right? There's obviously going to be fingers pointed at the coach. There's obviously fingers pointed at the players, and rightfully so in both cases. But ultimately, I think the biggest thing is, okay, well, we saw these players and we saw Rick Tocchet make the playoffs last year. We saw them be a top team in the NHL. And quite frankly, the answer to the question isn't, oh, well, every team stopped taking the Canucks lightly like maybe they did last year. That's always the excuse you hear. That's not it. That's not it. We saw these players. We saw this coach. Like, Tocchet didn't drastically change his system. In fact, he wanted to create more off the rush this season, but that project's basically on hold for as long as he has this blue line, because the blue line that they've been supplied with has been garbage. It's been bad. It's been really bad. You've got Noah Juleson playing top 4 minutes. You've got Vincent Desharnais, who, by the way, Vincent Desharnais has started to really look better as a third pairing guy, but still, like, that's a flawed roster because your third pairing guy doesn't slide up to be your second pairing guy. Your seventh defenseman, Noah Juleson, goes into the top 4 because you can't trust Desharnais to do anything more than what he's currently doing right now. So again, I don't want to nitpick on certain guys because it's been the blue line as a whole minus Quinn Hughes, and obviously they're missing Philip Peronic as well, so that really hurts. But ultimately, like, I look at this team, and the biggest story for me is like the roster is not constructed very well.
I feel like this is a therapy session for you, which is kind of hilarious because your team has won rounds, plural, and been to a Stanley Cup final in the last 15 years. And we all know the story with the Toronto Maple Leafs, been one series victory in like 20 years. I will say a bit of a gift, for Vancouver in this game. Dennis Hildeby is going to get the start. That's another topic of conversation in this market with Joseph Woll. Like, you have to be so careful how they deploy this guy because of the injury history. He played 2 games in a row, so they're going to go to Hildeby, get him in there. He's been shaky. I mean, early on in his career, they call him the Hildebeest, but it's been up and down. His last start against Philadelphia, I thought he was really good after the first goal was an ugly one to surrender, but he really bounced back. And maybe this is a good spot, and I always say that carefully, especially when they play the Vancouver Canucks, because, Quads, I don't know about you. I know they've dropped 4 in a row on this road trip. This is the 5th and final game. I would not be shocked at all if Vancouver, and I'll be honest, that scares the hell out of me. You tell me the travel woes this team went through. They come into Toronto, they're going to be fired up. I guarantee the first couple shifts of this game, even though Vancouver's been a train wreck as of late, they're going to be fired up to play this game. I just have that feeling.
Well, that's interesting because they're probably going to start that Kiefer Sherwood line, and that's one guy I'm sure we're going to talk about is Kiefer Sherwood just been an absolute energizer bunny. But I want to ask you about the Leafs as well, and we'll cross over. We'll ask each other some questions here. One thing that I wanted to ask you, Nick, was this season, like, I see Toronto's record. I've seen a lot of their games. The one thing that stands out to me about this Leafs team is, like, they don't lose consecutive games very often. They've done that 5 times this year, and their longest losing streak is 3 games. So for that reason, I look at it and say, okay, like, the chances of the Canucks' chances in this game, to me, go down when you consider how good the Leafs have been at not compounding losses. And to me, like, that's an identity thing for me. That's something that I think comes from the coach. That comes from Craig Berube. What, other than that, other than the fact that they don't compound losses very often, what's been the thing, if you're a Leafs fan, that kind of stands out as being the reason for, okay, you know what? The regular season is going to pivot into playoff success this year.
Well, it's surprising in the fact that Vancouver was this way last year. I think the word you're looking for, Quads, is response. But I think anybody who's watched the Leafs ad nauseum this season would talk about their defensive structure, similar to Vancouver last year, right? Where it's every game dialed in defensively, and that's been the big story under Craig Berube. This team pretty much has the same record and the same amount of points as they would and have had under Sheldon Keefe, but the product looks different, right? I think it's all about a process, an 82-game process to get to the Stanley Cup playoffs, and ultimately the proof will be in the pudding. We'll get to the postseason and see if this team is different, but I think if the Leafs are on their game tonight, which they should, that's a sidebar story. I know you guys lost to the Canes on Friday, but the Maple Leafs had a 2-0 lead in that game, evaporate, losing 6-3. And the big boys, the top line with Nyes, Matthews, and Marner, who have been on fire dating back to last weekend, a combined minus 17 in that game. So, like, that's the big topic du jour in this market is the response. What kind of response are we going to get from the big boys? Again, Marner had a bad game. Matthews a -6. Nyes wasn't himself. I mean, up and down that roster you think is going to be a response. But I think when the Leafs are dialed in, it's like that defensive structure. They're getting the key saves, and the defense are moving the puck way differently. And again, I would make it very, very similar to what Vancouver did last season specifically.
How about the goaltending? What's the goaltending been like in Toronto this year? Because it feels like, and again, outsider's perspective, but it feels like every year when they get to the playoffs, the Leafs fans end up blaming the goaltender for why things didn't go well. How's the goaltending been?
Well, Quads, that's the misconception with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Like me and Rosie and Huts and everybody over at the Leafs Nation, we talk about that a lot. When this team loses in the playoffs, believe it or not, it's not Ilya Samsonov. I mean, that was a big story last year, but I mean, it's not like he let 18 goals in that series. It's more about the power play, which watch out for that. It doesn't sound like the Maple Leafs are going to go back to that 5 forward set on PP1, which is just atrocious. I don't know why they tried, but this is an evolving story. Their power play is so bad, and it doesn't make sense. On top of that, it's the power play and not being able to score goals, like believe it or not, right? Because the goaltending in general, I think for the most part, come the postseason, has been good enough to win a series. But yeah, that's my major takeaway from this team this year specifically is the crease. And Anthony Stolarz, I believe earlier today, Craig Berube disclosing that he's going to start skating early in the week, which is great news because he was having a Vezina caliber season. I'm not kidding on that front in his first half. Joseph Woll has been excellent lately. And again, as mentioned, Dennis Hildeby is going to start this game. But as you know, in Vancouver too, like goaltending, such a big story. I'll be honest, I get on Thatcher Demko quite a bit. Like you can't trust these guys, man. They're at the morning skate, then they're not there for the start, but we believe it's going to be Kevin Lankinen right in this game. 15-7-6, 2-6-0, and 9-0-4, 3 shutouts. I wouldn't say not too shabby for a guy they signed late, right?
Oh, absolutely. I was saying late in the offseason, the Canucks needed Kevin Lankinen, and Kevin Lankinen needed the Canucks. And if you recall, there was that injury to John Gibson. Kevin Lankinen probably could have got more money if he waited a week or two, but he didn't want it to bleed into the preseason. So he signs with the Canucks on the 3rd day of training camp, and he's been an absolute godsend for this team. Nick, when we talk about MVPs and I talk about Quinn Hughes, and Arun Srinivasan and I did a crossover article over at LeafsNation.com, and one thing I noted was if Quinn Hughes is the Canucks MVP, which he is, Kevin Lankinen is a close number 2 because the only reason this team is keeping its head above water on the playoff bar and the reason they're still in this conversation is because of Kevin Lankinen. I shouldn't say the only reason because Quinn Hughes is a big reason as well, but Kevin Lankinen has been massive to their success. He's given them the goaltending that they needed with Thatcher Demko out. And quite frankly, Nick, like Thatcher Demko's season hasn't gotten off to a good start. And you knew there was going to be that feeling out process, but we've all seen it. Like Thatcher Demko's led in some soft goals. I believe, and I have to be careful how I talk about this, but I believe he's changed his stance a bit. I'd like to talk to Demko about that before I go too hard on it, but I believe he's changed the way he's playing a bit. We heard that was going to be something that may have happened with the Popliteus injury that he suffered. I believe he's changed the way he's played a bit, and I think it might be just something he has to get used to, but I also think there's some truth to the fact that the way he played last year made him a Vezina caliber goaltender, and the changes that he's made has led to what we're seeing right now, which isn't great goaltending. Now, again, I don't want to put that out there too hard and have it as like, I'm sure this is happening. I want to talk to Demko about it before I spout off about it. But I believe that he's changed the way he's played a bit. And I at least think it's something he's consciously having to work through. So I think that kind of tells you the story with Thatcher Demko. But with regards to Kevin Lankinen, he's been phenomenal for this team. He's given them the goaltending. He's been a rock and goal. He's stolen them games. And that was the thing that you weren't sure you were going to get was the stealing of games. But that's been happening for him. It's been happening for the Canucks this season.
Simply outstanding for sure when you look at Kevin Lankinen and just his importance to this Vancouver Canucks roster. Again, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button at the Leafs Nation 401, at Canucks Army, the crossover you all been waiting for. Canucks Conversation, Leafs Morning Take, Nick Alberga, David Quadrelli. I think that the big thing with this Leafs team that's been a lot different this season, I think everybody knows it, is the blue line. And the one guy I want to talk about with you is Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Like, I don't think this conversation is big enough, the job Paul Maurice did. You watch this guy play significantly, obviously, in Vancouver. It is night and day, I'm telling you, from even the Phoenix Coyote, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, to the Vancouver Canuck, Ekman-Larsson, to the Florida Panthers one. Like, it's still surreal to me to watch the player and just how stable he's become back there.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, like with Paul Maurice, you just said it, like he's not being asked to be a 1-2, and he's not really being asked to be a 1-2 in Toronto either, which I think is the big thing. And I'm not saying he's getting soft deployment or anything like that, but when you're not the guy, it kind of changes your outlook, and it changes ultimately what you're being asked to do. And I think they found the sweet spot. I think they found the sweet spot in Florida. I think Toronto recognized that was the sweet spot, and they hit it as well in Toronto, whereas in Vancouver, in Arizona, like you were saying, like he was the guy and there wasn't many more guys behind him, if that makes sense. Like in Vancouver, they had Quinn Hughes, but again, like Oliver Ekman-Larsson was still the matchup guy. Like they were using Oliver Ekman-Larsson for heavy matchups. And again, I'm not saying the Leafs aren't doing that because he has played some pretty heavy minutes for this team and he's done a great job, but just that element of not being the guy relied upon first over the boards when you need a defensive zone stop. Like that, I think that means a lot for the player's confidence, and I think you're seeing the results of it. I'm super happy for Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Always a great dude when he was out here. Really liked him.
It really is interesting when you look at this Maple Leafs blue line, because the thought was out there. Ekman-Larsson comes in, he's going to be a 5-6 pairing. Chris Tanev's going to come in, he's going to play with Morgan Rielly, but that hasn't been the story. Like, the big evolving story, and it's a BC guy, is Morgan Rielly just not living up to the expectation of that contract, getting $7.5 million per season. I get it. That can go out the window. Comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs. Morgan Rielly is a playoff performer. He proved this a couple years back when they finally won a round against the Tampa Bay Lightning before falling again to the Florida Panthers. But I'm curious to see how the Maple Leafs handle that blue line over the next couple months leading up to March 7th, because Luke Schen's a guy who me and Rosie obviously have close ties to, but I think would be a perfect fit. He's a guy, as you know, very well in Vancouver, played with Quinn Hughes. He's played with Morgan Rielly before, but it just seems like I've been year after year having this conversation. When are we going to find Morgan Rielly a partner? When does Morgan Rielly become the problem is my question.
So I saw you talking about this, and I'm curious because you obviously watch a lot more Leafs games than I do. What's gone away in his game? Because this is what I always try to diagnose. When you see a player, like for Ekman-Larsson in Vancouver, it was like the foot speed just wasn't there, and he couldn't keep up, right? But now he simplified his game, and it's led to some massive changes and some great results. But he was trying to defend the way that he used to before. If I had to diagnose it, that's what happened with Oliver Ekman-Larsson. What's your diagnosis on Morgan Rielly? What's changed?
It is confidence. The skating's been there. He's very pass first. Like I like to equate it to him being like, not to this degree, but like the Mitch Marner of the blue line, where he defers. And the power play, again, getting back to that. I mean, Morgan Rielly's run that power play for like the last decade, and he's not a shot first guy. Like every team knows. I mean, obviously the Leafs can't have a guy to the stature of like a Quinn Hughes running PP1, but just a guy who will keep the defense honest. Like, when Morgan Rielly has the puck, he's not going to shoot the puck. And I think that's the one thing missing in his game. But I honestly think it's confidence, because, again, Quads, we saw it a couple years ago in the playoffs. After signing that contract he was phenomenal, but just hasn't found that level. And it's really weird because you thought this would have been the year for like another breakout for Morgan Rielly because of the depth they added. Like, even if Phil Myers has been an excellent addition, Connor Timmins has been really, really solid and steady. Benoit's been good. We mentioned the two guys that came in the form of Tanev and Ekman-Larsson. Like, the table was set for Rielly, but unfortunately, he just hasn't been doing it offensively. Like, he went through a 26-game goalless drought that just ended the other day, and that's been another story with this team. They're not really getting offense from the blue line. Like, obviously, Ekman-Larsson's going to ground and pound. Same for Tanev. He's going to get in front of like pretty much every puck, but offense of the blue line, not quite the same in Toronto as it is in Vancouver these days.
It's been good in Vancouver, I'll tell you that. I want to ask
Hronek, by the way. Philip Hronek, when's he coming back?
Yeah. So he's doing AHL conditioning right now. He's actually on pace to return a lot sooner than we all thought. You have 14 days down in the AHL when you're on a conditioning stint. He's not going to play in any AHL games, but he is down there. I believe there was a report the other day that he's elite AHL conditioning right now, or something like that. He's doing great in those AHL conditioning drills. So
was that an Alan Walsh tweet or what?
No, you would think no. It was Sports Eddie and McTire, and I'm just making a joke. But IMAC did report that Philip Hronek is doing really well in his AHL conditioning. He's impressing. He is on pace to return sooner than expected. So that's a welcome addition for the Canucks blue line. Again, a guy who's going to create offense. But the big thing that I've been saying for a bit now is when he comes back, you have to split him and Hughes up. At the start of the year, you had Hughes, you had Hronek together. Hughes Myers has been fine. You need to split up Hughes and Hronek. You have to at this juncture, because just how bad the rest of the blue line's been. You have to. There's really no other option. You can't go back to Susie Myers. We've seen that movie, and it's not a good one. You've got to try Hronek on his own pairing. He hasn't had much of a chance to do it, but there was that game against the Ottawa Senators where Hughes was ejected really early in the game. Hronek goes on to play 25 plus minutes that night, running PP1, and he played great. He did a great job. So I'm thinking you have to split those two up. But I want to ask you something about the Leafs, because I brought up Kiefer Sherwood. He's kind of the energy guy. He's kind of a X factor. I won't call him underrated, but maybe in other markets people wouldn't know about him. Who's that guy on the Leafs? Who's been the guy on the Leafs that Canucks fans will maybe notice tonight because he does something crazy that maybe we haven't seen this year?
I got two guys for you. I mean, not to the extent offensively as what Sherwood's done, but Steven Lorentz has been a really good addition for a guy they brought in a PTO. Nobody wanted to sign the guy, but he has been so good to the point where people are already talking about an extension for Steven Lorentz. The other guy is a veteran. Max Pacioretty's coming back in the lineup. By the way, the Leafs lines at the morning skate: Nyes, Matthews, Marner, Pacioretty, Tavares, Nylander, McMahon, Domi, Robertson, Lorentz, Kampf, and Dewar. So Holmberg and Reeves are going to be the healthy scratches up front. Pacioretty has been such a big story just because really has been known for like his physical stature, like his body, his size, and using it. And that's been the evolution, I think, of his game. I don't know if it's a Craig Berube thing, but it seems like every game Max Pacioretty is a crushing body check. And I think we're going to see it tonight. I think he's going to be fired up after the healthy scratch. It's only happened a couple times this season. And I think a comparable guy, just because he's done it offensively earlier on in his career, is probably a Max Pacioretty. Like it's still weird to me, I don't know for you, to see Pacioretty in the blue and white because he is the former captain of the Montreal Canadiens. But he has really made a difference. For a guy, a lot of people weren't really liking that conversation to begin with coming into the season to sign that contract. But when he's in there, I think it's been a nice story.
So when he's in there, 29 games played for Pacioretty this season.
Got hurt too.
What's been the story of his season? What's he been dealing with?
So he had a hamstring pull early on this season. He came back maybe in early December. So that's why he's only played 29. But he went from a guy who I think was struggling to find sort of where he fit in the lineup. A lot of people, envision him being a bottom six guy. I think even still at this age, the physical presence he's bringing, I think he's better served for the top six. And that's where we're going to see him in this game, playing with Tavares and Nylander. And that line has had better games, than they've had recently together. Having said that, there have been moments where they just click. I mean, similar with the Vancouver Canucks and some of their different configurations, it seems like they're onto something with this Pacioretty, Tavares, Nylander thing. And if I were to handicap things, if the playoffs started tomorrow, I think that'd be a line. I think, when the playoffs do start, I think it could be a line because I believe in Nyes, Matthews, and Marner. I mean, if we don't see a trade where a guy comes in from the top six, I think Pacioretty's a guy who's going to be in the top six.
I want to quickly ask you about that. I know it's a game day preview, but I want to ask you, Canucks wish list for the trade deadline, top four defensemen. It was Rasmus Anderson. He came out yesterday, said he hates the Canucks. He hates the Oilers. Let's not talk about that. Leafs trade deadline wish list. I keep seeing stuff about a center. It's interesting. And quickly to divert, on Friday's episode of Canucks Conversation, Harman Dial and I were previewing the Carolina Hurricanes, and we were talking about how much of an advantage it is to have the level of depth where you can put a guy like Andrei Svechnikov on your third line because you can have a guy that is playing in your that Robinson kid. He's phenomenal. When you can have a guy like him playing in your top six, and obviously different ages between him and Max Pacioretty, but Max Pacioretty may be on paper not someone you would think would be playing in the Leafs top six. But when I look at the Leafs line combinations, like maybe Bobby McMahon's that guy. Obviously he's not Andrei Svechnikov, but like, does it feel like the Leafs could take better advantage of having a guy like Pacioretty that can play in their top six with some savvy moves at the deadline?
I think so. I think to answer your question, I think we're looking for, we're being like the media are looking at the Leafs looking at a top nine center, we'll say. They keep talking about somebody with term. I don't know if that's actually going to happen. I think it's more likely they get a rental. I don't know if they have, the means to get a Brock Nelson. Like in a perfect world, Brock Nelson's a guy who I think the Leafs could target on July 1 if he gets there. I don't know if it's going to be a play right now just because of assets. I know the Canucks may be a bit of a different story when it comes to that, but the Leafs barely have picks. They don't want to trade any of their prospects. Easton Cowan's coming off a tough World Junior. I think they're going to bring in a guy, but to your point, every year I always like to bring up the comparison when Colorado won Arturi Lehkonen. What a pickup that has proven to be in the last couple of years. Ivan Barbashev with the Vegas Golden Knights. The one guy I'm very curious about, and doubtful it happens because I think Boston's going to figure it out. It's Boston. But Trent Frederick, I think those type of players, they fly under the radar because, man, when's the last time a team made like a marquee pickup at the deadline and went on to win a Stanley Cup? Was it like Marian Gaborik 15 years ago? The perfect example is the New York Rangers a couple years back. They got Patrick Kane, they got Tarasenko. They were an all-star team on paper, but then it got to the playoffs and they just didn't have the right pieces. The chemistry was off. So I think it's the little tweaks like that. from the Maple Leafs perspective, I think they've made a decision that it's not going to be Max Domi up the middle. You're going to see him as a 3C tonight. In a perfect world, you're picking up, a Swiss Army knife, but somebody who can play up the middle, maybe even like a Jake Evans in Montreal.
Jake Evans is an interesting target for this Leafs team. And I agree with you. It's a really interesting note on roster construction because those teams usually have it. They have the top guys, and then they go make that addition, as you're saying. That's really interesting. And I'd be curious to look over Frank Cervelli's trade targets list over at Daily Faceoff, see if there's anyone there. I mean, Teddy Bluger's struggling right now. Teddy Bluger might be a nice fit for this Leafs team. I'm
You think they're selling? You think Vancouver sells? Like, we got to talk about this. I mean, the elephant in the room here is Patterson and Miller. Like, I don't know how you feel. Obviously, I cover the entire NHL. I think something's going to happen here. I don't want to call it imminent. I would not be shocked in the next week if one of these guys is dealt. I don't know if you feel differently.
I do feel a little differently. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something before the deadline, but I also know that the Canucks right now are looking at it and saying, like, with the struggles that their team's having right now, again, with this 4-game losing streak, I don't think they look at it and say, oh, well, if we just deal Patterson or Miller, that's the shakeup that this team needs. I really don't think that's the way they're going to approach things. It might be. So, like, again, I'm not trying to come here and say, no, it's not going to happen. I just think that their preference would be to make this trade in the offseason, to try to make this trade when the season's over. That being said, I also think they want to make the playoffs, and I think they want to be well positioned to do that. So I could see anything. And at the end of the day, not to do the Friedman thing, but I could see them not doing anything either. And I know that their preference, their preference is for both guys to just work it out. It's been their preference all along before it got leaked to the media and before it all started getting out there, before Hughes and Talkett owned up to it. That was always the preference internally. And I think it still is, even though they've, taken the route of shaming both guys publicly. They want to deal with this internally. They want to handle this internally. So, and they hope both guys can just figure it out. They signed both players long-term. That's obviously preference number one. Again, not to speculate too much, but I wonder how much longer they're going to hope that ends up happening. We'll see.
Yeah, it just seems really, really petty. I'll be honest. I got a text the other day and I was floored. Somebody I know in Vancouver was suggesting Elias Pettersson was good enough to play in one of those games and just was like, I don't think tonight's the night for me, man. I don't know how you answer this question, but I prefer JT Miller. I don't care if he's in his 30s or Elias Pettersson. You got to work to motivate a guy who makes $11.6 million a season. Think about that.
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. I'm always going to go with the younger player, the guy who's defensively responsible, produces at 5-on-5. At its core, Elias Pettersson is a better player than JT Miller. We don't I don't like to simplify it that much, but I think right now Elias Pettersson's a better player than JT Miller, even though I think JT Miller is giving you more than Elias Pettersson is, which is a concern. That being said, I think we can both answer the question pretty safely. Who's going to be producing more in 2 years? Who's going to be the better player in 2 years? And JT Miller still has 6 years left on his contract? I'd have to look at it right off the top of my head, but he's got more than 2 years left on that contract. So again, 11.6 is a big number, of course, but you have the track record with Elias Pettersson, and I think it's a really, really complicated situation that doesn't just come down to saying, okay, keep this guy over that guy. And I think ultimately, that's why the Canucks are calling on both guys and making calls to teams about both guys and fielding offers for both guys.
Look, I like playing the blame game. I mean, Patrick Allvin deserves a lot of heat. Rutherford does for signing the contract. This is insanity to me, man. Not to get too fired up about it, but the guy makes so much money. Where's Bubble Pettersson at, man? He was out of this world in the bubble playoffs. And last year in the postseason, nowhere to be found. I understand what you're saying. It's very reasonable. It makes a lot of sense why you keep the younger guy. But I think of JT Miller, I think about playoff hockey, and he's got it written all over him. I think it could ultimately be a big mistake if you trade any of these guys, but specifically Miller. Pettersson, I could deal with it because I think there's a team out there who feels they can rectify him and give you what you want in a trade and actually probably makes your roster a bit better.
Oh yeah, so that's the thing is you're going to get more in a Patterson trade, obviously. Yeah. That being said, you don't win those trades usually.
No.
Jack Eichel trade, Matthew Tkachuk trade, all these trades that come up when you're giving up the best player, it's just really hard to win those trades. But on the point of being a playoff performer, JT did it last year. Like JT did it. JT's also playing hurt. So again, when I say I would probably look at moving Miller over Patterson. I'm not trying to take anything away from JT. He's been great. He's had the lapses. He's had the frustration back in his game. But that's another thing with the past few games. Like he had the 4-point night the other night. JT has been playing the way that you expect, even though the past couple weeks before that he wasn't, and he was actually playing quite poorly. A lot of the mistakes in his game, a lot of the laziness, the slow line changes. I'm assuming him and Tocchet had a talk about that, as they usually end up doing, because he's played great. His defensive impact's been there. His the effort is there, and that's the question with JT. Had a bad turnover against Carolina, but in terms of what you're seeing from JT Miller, we have seen a lot from him in the playoffs, and we have seen a lot from him there recently. But the thing that I always come back to is just like, okay, well, they're both signed long term, so what does it look like in 2-3 years? I'm going to bank on the fact that Patterson is going to be a better player in like two years. I
agree.
Miller. So yeah. Again, it's hard to handicap, and it's hard to approach the question that way, but that's just the way it is. I think is that Patterson is going to be the better player if he's not already.
Yeah, it's just such a polarizing debate right now. Like, you don't want to be forced. Your hand doesn't want to be forced, especially for something petty like this. Two guys don't like each other, man. You've lived long enough. You've worked long enough as well, Quads. I mean, you're not going to like everybody you work with. Be a pro. And I think Quinn Hughes has done the best he could. You know, I followed Quinn Hughes since he was 13, 14 years old. I know his trainer really well. I know the Hughes family. I know what they're about. And I think Quinn Hughes is an excellent captain. But this has become bigger than that, where it's spiraling out of control, where now it's affecting the team, where you don't know what you're going to get when these two guys are on the ice. Like, Patterson comes back and they lose 2-0, and they muster 14 shots on goal against Dustin Tokarski. Like, I just finished that conversation the other day about the Leafs. I know they beat Philadelphia, but Ivan Fedotov is one of the worst goalies in the NHL right now, statistically and also just eye test. And they let him off the hook in that game. Like, shoot the puck. I think simplifying the game is going to be a big story for me. It's time for the last call here, brought to you by Bet365. Open an account with Bet365 today and bet on a huge range of markets, whatever the moment. It's never ordinary at Bet365. Use code NATION, all in uppercase today. That's NATION, N-A-T-I-O-N. Any bets you like? I think I'm going to take the under in this game.
The under, I think that's a good bet, especially with the way the Canucks played last night. Don't know how hard the Leafs' foot is going to be on the gas pedal tonight.
Well, that's the thing to me. I just think the under, just because, again, Tocchet and Berube are pals. I mean, that's an underrated storyline going into this game. Hildeby's playing. Lankinen's playing, who is like the quote-unquote backup, but not really. I'd call him the 1B right now in Vancouver. And I think you have two defensive-minded teams. Like, the Leafs are coming off a game where they surrendered 6 goals, and I think that's their bread and butter, believe it or not, is goaltending and defense this season, given the star power they have.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And look, you just said lock it down. It's going to be that lock it down style, and that's what we're going to see tonight. I think that's a good bet. I think taking the under is a savvy bet. You would have nailed it last night as well.
Yeah, I think so. The other bets I like a Nylander anytime goal and Jake DeBrusk. I looked up the stats. He only has like 6 goals in 18 career games against the Maple Leafs in the regular season, but for some reason he plays them well. Specifically in Hockey Night in Canada, I would not be stunned if DeBrusk scores in this game. I believe he's due. I'd probably play the shot prop as well. Anybody on Vancouver you're looking at? I know it's tough to, put your crystal ball out there when you get 14 shots on goal and a loss, right?
I'm going to go with Elias Pettersson. Thought he played pretty well last night. All things considered, against Carolina, like, they were creating chances when he was on the ice. And that didn't happen when other players were on the ice last night. And finally, on the Miller Pettersson thing, I think the thing that we really should focus on is kind of what you concluded the thought with, was that it's probably not ideal to trade either of these guys, which is why, like, you hope that both guys can just grow up and figure it out. Like, I've always been on team, you're paid millions of dollars, figure it out. And I've said that from the start. I don't want to see the team trade either of these guys. I think both of them are really important to the team, and you hope that they can just figure it out.
Quads, I'm sorry, but go Leafs, go. This has been a lot of fun, bud.
Fair enough. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
At the Leafs Nation 401 on YouTube, where you can subscribe to our YouTube page here, Leafs Morning Take, at Canucks Army on YouTube, and Canucks Conversation, wherever you find your podcast, Leafs Morning Take, wherever you find your podcasts. And make sure you leave us a 5-star review. That's David Quadrelli in Vancouver. I'm Nick Alberga here in Toronto. Enjoy the game, folks. Take care. Make sure to check out more of our content right here on the Leafs Nation YouTube page. We got long form interviews, we got clips, we got epic rants by Jay Rosa. We simply have it all. And don't forget, you can find out much more at theleafsnation.com. Thanks so much for watching.